In the spring of 1968, a woman named Cleotha Jennings carried a covered dish up the back steps of Mount Olive Baptist Church in Orangeburg, South Carolina, balancing it against her hip, the same way she'd carried 5 children through that same door over the years. Inside that dish was something bright red, wobbling slightly with every step, packed with fruit cocktail and marshmallows suspended like they were frozen in glass. By the time the fellowship hall tables filled up that Sunday, there were 40 dishes just like hers. No two exactly alike. Every single one made from a recipe that lived only in somebody's head. Nobody wrote these down. Nobody needed to. The fellowship hall itself ran on folding tables, borrowed chafing dishes, and a quiet rotation of women who each knew exactly which dish to bring, so the whole line balanced out by the time the last plate got filled. This is what I do. Dig up the dishes that used to define an entire community's Sunday afternoon and ask why so many of them simply vanished. Before we're through, you'll hear about a dish stuffed straight into its own shell, a New Year's tradition that traces back 3 centuries to West Africa, and a gravy some families considered more important than the meat it was served with. My name is Uncle Elijah, and today we're heading into the church fellowship hall. 10 dishes that used to cover every table after Sunday service, starting with the one you've probably forgotten existed at all. Number 10, congealed salad. Built from flavored gelatin, canned fruit, shredded carrots or crushed pineapple, and sometimes a layer of cream cheese folded through the middle. This dish was set in a mold and chilled for hours until it held its shape well enough to be turned out onto a plate and sliced like a cake. It sat on nearly every church supper table across the South from the 1950s through the 1970s, prized specifically because it could be made a full day ahead and required no last-minute attention on a busy Sunday morning. Every woman in the congregation had her own version, argued over gently at the dessert table, and whichever mold came back empty first was considered the unofficial winner of that week's potluck. In a South Carolina summer, with no air conditioning in the fellowship hall, keeping a congealed salad firm long enough to slice and serve took real planning, which only added to the quiet pride attached to pulling it off. Number 9, ham loaf. When a whole ham was too expensive or too much for a single household to justify, ground ham mixed with ground pork, breadcrumbs, egg, and a sweet glaze of brown sugar and mustard became the answer. Shaped into a loaf, baked low and slow until the glaze caramelized into a dark, sticky crust. It stretched a smaller, cheaper cut of meat across a much larger crowd than a whole ham ever could, which made it a natural fit for a fellowship hall table that might need to feed 80 people instead of 8. Sliced thin and served alongside rice or potato salad, ham loaf let a family show up with real meat on the table without the cost of an entire ham weighing on the week's budget. A good glaze was a point of quiet competition in its own right, and some cooks swore a splash of pineapple juice worked into the brown sugar made all the difference by the time it came out of the oven. Number 8, chicken spaghetti. Shredded chicken, a rich cheese sauce, diced bell pepper and onion, and a can of tomatoes folded through cooked spaghetti, baked in a deep casserole dish until the top turned golden and slightly crisp at the edges. This dish became a fellowship hall standard specifically because it traveled well. It could ride in the back seat of a car for 20 minutes on a hot Sunday afternoon and still arrive warm, still hold together on a paper plate. It fed a crowd for very little money, using 1 chicken and a box of pasta to cover a serving line of 30 people or more, and it did it with enough cheese and seasoning that nobody at the table ever felt like they were eating a stretched meal. Now, it's worth stopping here on something bigger than any single recipe. For most of the 20th century, the Black church wasn't just a place of worship. It was the center of an entire community's economic and social life, one of the only institutions Black families fully owned and controlled in a segregated South. The Sunday supper that followed service wasn't a minor tradition. It was where information got shared, where struggling families quietly got fed, and where a woman's cooking could earn her real standing in a community that offered few other public stages. Every dish on this list carries that weight. Food made not just to be eaten, but to represent a family, a household, sometimes an entire reputation, on a folding table in a fellowship hall. Pastors used that same fellowship hall to organize everything from burial societies to voter drives. And the supper afterward was often where the real planning actually happened, over plates instead of podiums. Keep that in mind as we move further down this list. Number 7, string beans and new potatoes. Fresh green beans, snapped by hand, cooked low and slow for hours with a piece of fatback or a smoked ham hock until they turned deep olive green and nearly fell apart, joined partway through by small whole new potatoes that soaked up every bit of that smoky, salted broth. This wasn't a quick blanched, bright green vegetable side. It was cooked until soft on purpose, the way an entire generation of Southern cooks understood vegetables were supposed to be treated. A single pot could feed dozens once potatoes were added to stretch it, and the broth left behind at the bottom of the pot was often spooned over rice or soaked up with a piece of cornbread so nothing went to waste. Whoever brought this dish usually showed up early, because a pot cooked that long needed a full morning on the stove before anyone in the fellowship hall ever saw it. Number 6. Succotash. Corn cut fresh off the cob and lima beans, cooked together with a little butter, salt pork, and sometimes a few chopped tomatoes until the whole dish turned into something sweet, starchy, and satisfying. Corn and beans grew easily and cheaply in almost any southern garden, which made succotash one of the most affordable vegetable dishes a family could bring to a shared table, requiring almost no meat at all to taste complete. It filled the gap on a fellowship hall table between the heavier meat dishes and the salads. A dependable, inexpensive side that nearly every family had a version of, even if almost nobody makes it for a potluck today. Some cooks leaned sweeter with extra corn, others leaned savory with more salt pork, and a fellowship hall table might end up with 3 or 4 versions sitting side by side without anyone thinking twice about it. Number 5. Smothered pork chops and rice. Pork chops seared hard in a skillet, then simmered low and slow under a thick blanket of onion gravy until they turned fork tender, served spooned generously over a bed of plain white rice. This was a dish built for stretching. A cheaper, tougher cut of pork chop, given enough time on the stove, could turn tender enough to fool anyone into thinking it came from a finer cut of meat. Served at church suppers alongside greens and cornbread, smothered pork chops represented a real meat dish a family could bring proudly to a shared table, made from a cut most butchers sold at a fraction of the price of anything fancier. Number 4. Deviled crab. Along the coastal low country of South Carolina and Georgia, where the Gullah Geechee community preserved West African cooking traditions across generations, crab meat mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, mustard, and a sharp kick of hot pepper was packed back into its own clean shell and baked until the top turned golden and slightly crisp. This dish depended entirely on where a congregation lived. Coastal churches near the water built entire fellowship suppers around it, while inland churches rarely saw it at all. For the families who did make it, deviled crab represented a direct, living connection to West African foodways carried across the Atlantic, still showing up on a church table 200 and 300 years later. Cleaning and picking the crab meat by hand took real time before the dish was ever assembled, which made it a labor of love more than a quick contribution to the table. Number 3. Hoppin' John. Black-eyed peas simmered with smoked pork until tender, then stirred together with rice into a single, hearty pot. A dish that traces directly back to West African cowpea and rice traditions carried into the Carolina Lowcountry by enslaved people who had farmed rice for generations before they ever set foot in America. Traditionally served on New Year's Day, with the peas symbolizing coins and the greens served alongside representing dollar bills, Hoppin' John carried real weight beyond its taste. Families believed the dish could set the tone of luck and prosperity for the entire year ahead. Some families held to the old rule of leaving exactly 3 peas on the plate before rising from the table, a small, quiet ritual most people today have never even heard of, let alone practiced. Number 2. Giblet gravy, built from a chicken or turkey's giblets. The heart, gizzard, and liver simmered until tender, chopped fine, and stirred into a rich pan gravy thickened with flour and the bird's own drippings. Poured generously over rice or cornbread dressing, giblet gravy turned parts of the bird that most modern cooks throw away without a second thought into what many families considered the actual star of the plate. Some households guarded their giblet gravy recipe more closely than the recipe for the bird itself, insisting that a Sunday dinner without it simply wasn't complete, no matter how well everything else on the table had turned out. Getting the chop right mattered too. Cut too coarse and the gravy felt clumsy. Cut too fine and it lost the texture that made it worth making in the first place. Number 1. Not the dish anyone bragged about, and not the one that earned a woman her reputation in the congregation. Macaroni salad. Cold, boiled macaroni tossed with mayonnaise, a little mustard, chopped boiled egg, sweet pickle relish, and diced pimento, chilled until serving. It never showed up in anyone's Sunday best conversation, and nobody ever asked for the recipe at the door on their way out. But nearly every single fellowship hall table, in nearly every decade of the 20th century, had at least one bowl of it sitting somewhere in the lineup, because it was cheap, it traveled well in the summer heat, and it filled a plate without competing with the meat dish beside it. I put it at number one, not because it was anyone's favorite, but because more black church suppers, across more decades, featured this exact bowl than almost anything else on this entire list. The quiet, unglamorous dish that showed up every single week, whether anyone noticed it or not. So tell me, which of these did your church actually serve? And which one do you wish somebody still brought to the table? I read every comment, and half of what ends up in this journal comes straight from families who were there, standing in that serving line themselves. If keeping this history alive matters to you, do something small about it. A church supper was never really about the food on the table. It was about who showed up, what they carried in their hands to get there, and the simple fact that nobody in that room ever had to eat alone. That fellowship hall is long gone in some towns now, but the recipes are still out there, waiting on somebody willing to ask their grandmother one more time before it's